now what? What's the next step without kind of descending into superstition and authoritarianism?
Mm-hmm.
So if we're looking for a kind of a rational, anti-authoritarian, creative, I would say, are the three sort of pillars. There might be a fourth, but those would be the three obvious ones. If a new religion or a new ritual practice, a new ritualized philosophy, in a sense, combines those three factors, then I would say it's a really good candidate for entry into the Poetic Faith canon.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning podcast, where we explore meaning in metamodernity and the meaning of metamodernity. I'm here today with a dear friend, colleague, and wonderful human soul, Tony Wolff. Tony Wolff is a storyteller, ritualist, teacher, and editor of this incredible new anthology coming out through Sky Meadow Press. And I guess by the time this will be posted, it'll be out. People can check this out. This is the next volume to come out through the press. It's called Poetic Faiths, New Religions and Rituals as Works of Living Art. And I'm here to, talk to Tony about this awesome book, which is actually just the first volume in a anthology series. But without further ado, let's dive in. Thanks, Tony, so much for coming on the podcast to talk about this really incredible artifact that you've helped construct.
Thank you, Brendan. Always a pleasure. And it just occurred to me, I think that you reading the title is literally the first time I've ever heard another human being speaking those words in that sequence. So we're off to a great start. A great pleasure. In fact, I was just thinking about this. I believe that I first had the idea for the anthology very, very shortly before first meeting you. It was the first time that I bowled up to Sky Meadow to do the Sacred Harvest.
That's really cool. Yeah. Well, let's set it up a little bit first so that people get a sense for this, and then I'd love to talk to you about what brought you to this project and your background work. You talk about this about your own living work of art here, your own Poetic Faith, the Mysterium, which maybe we can talk a little bit about. But for people curious about what this thing is, explain it a bit.
Sure. Well, this is an anthology. It's in the spirit of, I guess, if we go back to the 80s and 90s, some of the books that research used to put out, Modern Primitives and those sorts of things. That was kind of an inspiration. I read those books back in the day and enjoyed them. And they were interviews with practitioners of, I guess, unusual, culturally fringy art forms. So Modern Primitives, for example, was an anthology of interviews with folk who were very into tattooing, body modification rituals, and those sorts of things. In-depth illustrated interviews with these really interesting kind of outsider artists and thinkers. And I guess it was in late 2023 that I had the idea of trying to compile a similar anthology, interviewing folk who were the founders of what I think of as poetic faiths. And that phrase, I'm sure, is going to need some unpacking because I sort of coined it after a fashion. So the phrase poetic faith actually goes back to Samuel Taylor Coleridge back in the 1800s. And he used it actually as part of a conversation, sort of a poetic collaboration that he was having with another poet, in which his role was to, he spoke of conjuring for a moment the sense of poetic faith that offers the ability to suspend disbelief for a moment. And that I think that's a very powerful idea. And some time ago, it sort of struck me, actually during an interview, but maybe 10 years back, it struck me that by capitalizing the P and the F of that phrase, poetic faith, you could transform it from a literary device into something describing this very esoteric, very sort of niche phenomenon of people creating their own faiths, creating their own religion. So poesis, as in creativity, and faith, although it's usually understood as faith in the supernatural, doesn't have to be so. And that I sort of seized on that as a term because it describes this phenomenon that I've been kind of casually observing for about 35 years, just popping up in various little niche countercultures and fringe academia and all sorts of places, of people taking this unusual step of creating their own ritualized philosophies, their own non-theistic religious practices, all very, very metamodern.
Well, yeah, let me pause you there too, because
Yes, please.
I'll also say how, I think it was really exciting to connect with you because our work kind of overlaps a lot in this space. I'd written a book called Building the Cathedral, which is all about uh, it was under the category of personal mythology, which at that point was the best term that I'd yet found to talk about this phenomenon. I think Poetic Faiths now is a better term for that. And so yeah, we really connected because we shared this passion for this idea of mythopoeia, of myth making, of storytelling through kind of a religious register in a ritualized way, and the whole idea of sort of making your own religion in a way that I think it's very hard for maybe some people to immediately understand because they hear a term like that. They're like, wait a second, you're just trying to start a cult. And there's a lot of difficulty in trying to parse out the difference between trying to sort of establish a cult system of naive power structures where you can dominate other people versus trying to sort of personally craft an aesthetically rich expression using symbol and image to get at kind of deep existential philosophical orientations to reality. And so it was kind of a hard thing for me to find other people who like got it. When we connected, you'd been tracking this for a long time, and it just began a really rich collaboration. So I think it was really delightful, and this coming out through Sky Meadow Press is really really meaningful to me because well, for all those reasons and others we can speak of. So I just wanted to throw that in the mix of how some of that got started with us, and to speak to the idea of poetic faiths as capturing some of these things that again I've been tracking for a long time, and people who might be familiar with my work is also kind of speaking to.
I think it was Building the Cathedrals. I may have come. Was there an online copy of that, or I may have
Yeah, I
picked
think
it up
there was
through?
a couple versions, either like through the Substack or maybe it was also on
Yeah,
YouTube. Yeah.
I may have also read the ebook, but yeah, there are sections in there. That was where I first thought this man who lives in this wonderful place, need to need to be in contact with this guy. Yeah, and it is extraordinarily esoteric. My wife tells the story. She was a couple of years ago, I guess, when the project was just getting underway. She was describing it to a co-worker. Lovely lady, apparently, very much a sort of an Orthodox Christian. And my wife used the phrase non-theistic religion kind of casually. And this lady's jaw just dropped. And it's, wait.
Huh?
Non-theistic religion. And it takes time. Um, it yeah, this is a very curious and a very avant-garde concept, I think. Although, as I try to express in the introduction to the first volume of the anthology, it is an idea that has a history.
Mm.
It's just you've really got to peer into the nooks and crannies of history to
say a little bit more about it. Unpack this idea a little bit more of poetic faiths, because that'll be important. Obviously, this is going to be at least, I think, a 2 or 3 volume anthology of interviews. So, poetic faiths is sort of the category here. Yeah, say a little bit more about what constitutes a poetic faith.
Okay, I haven't really done a lot of defining in conversation, so I'm going to be improvising a bit. But I would say that a poetic faith tends to be rational. So it tends to, if we look at sort of first principles, almost all of the interviewees, the founders of these various, what I'm subsuming as poetic faiths, are beginning from a position of kind of secular humanist rationality. So we can kind of take for granted that the literally supernatural is not a real sort of ontological category.
Mm.
I'm not speaking for all of them. Some of them are a little more flexible. So this, from my point of view, taking that as a foundational position. So rather than kind of as people in internet atheism and so forth are inclined to do, arriving at that point and then that becoming the hill that they die on. That's where we start. That's where I started 40 years ago. And then saying, now what? So, okay, yes, we understand science and rationality and so forth. And of course, as everyone knows, that those will only get you so far in life. Now what? What's the next step without kind of descending into superstition and authoritarianism? Mm-hmm. So if we're looking for a kind of a rational, anti-authoritarian, creative, I would say, are the three sort of pillars. There might be a fourth, but those would be the three obvious ones. If a new religion or a new ritual practice, a new ritualized philosophy, in a sense, combines those three factors, then I would say it's a really good candidate for entry into the poetic faith canon.
Uh-huh. So it sort of begins from a self-aware stance of what religion almost as a category is, and in a sense, kind of what it does. Or this would be, I don't know, maybe one way of talking about it that I think in terms of, because I actually studied religion from undergrad. So for me, once you kind of start taking religion as an object or a category of analysis, you think about, well, what do religions do? What do faiths do? What do belief systems do? You're not really in it in a sense of you're naively taking what you've been given as the basis for understanding reality. You've kind of stepped back a little bit and you're sort of like, oh, this is a category of phenomena that is doing a certain kind of thing. And that's where I feel like that kind of rational reflective move comes in. And then, yeah, for me, that is the next question then is like, okay, you start from there and you move from there rather than having that sort of terminate in a sort of like what can easily become a sort of drab, materialistic, reductionistic kind of disenchanted worldview essentially, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, for me in thinking about poetic faiths, that's always been an important part of thinking about reenchantment through a kind of willed creative engagement with the kinds of modes and sensibilities and activities that religions have tended to successfully use to orient people to matters of meaning and significance. But I don't know if there's any other aspects besides those pillars that you named, or any other aspects of what kind of were the criteria in terms of reaching out to the folks doing these kinds of things. If you wanted to speak to any of that.
I'll re-emphasize, draw a red line underneath the idea of creativity, because that's one of the things I think that separates the concept of poetic faith from the mass of the spiritual but not religious and so forth. It's not simply a matter of eclecticism. It's not simply a matter of saying, well, look, I don't believe in a literally supernatural God, but I like this particular type of Buddhist meditation, and I also I read tarot, and it's not so much a matter of coagulating a number of extant practices. The folk that I'm most interested in this regard, are those who actually approach the thing as artists. So they're not only not afraid, but they absolutely embrace the chance of creating, of inventing from scratch. And I think it's important to underscore that, because without that creative element, the whole thing becomes kind of inchoate. And the artists who've created these things typically proceed from a very strong position of philosophical and non supernaturally, but spiritually, soulfully,
Mm-hmm.
Cogent, a life stance that they feel needs to be expressed through this kind of religious spiritual art.
Mm-hmm.
Creating it for themselves because they haven't found it anywhere else
Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which in practice, I think for many of them limits their practical appeal, because they're extraordinarily individualistic in the same way that a lot of art is. It's the product of the individual artist's creative freedom and creative vision.
Yeah. Yeah, like for me, just discovering the work of William Blake was really interesting in this regard. He has a great quote, which for a while I was sort of using as my tagline when I would think about what is my religion. He said something like, I must create a system or be bound by another man's. It is not my, it is my duty basically to create was his kind of I don't know, his motto when it came to the incredibly aesthetic and artistic work he was doing, but also a work he was doing that was also kind of prophetic in nature. It was a mixture between like myth telling and art in a way that he created a kind of elaborate, highly personalized mythopoetic system that was a way that he could express his kind of spiritual orientations. And the creativity bit is also really big. I mean, for a long time, I was also, besides using the term personal mythology, would talk about creative spirituality, which again, I think all of this is well subsumed under the categories that you're describing. So this book then is essentially what, an anthology of interviews with people doing these sorts of things. Say more about kind of how this is structured.
That's exactly it. Yeah. The first volume begins with a preface by Professor Coral Cusack of the University of Sydney in Australia. And she is a scholar of religion, religious studies, and history, I think, who famously has produced several works on the idea of invented religion, which is a term that's used in scholarship particularly to describe modern religions that draw a great deal of inspiration from works of pop culture. So Jediism and those sorts of things. And also to some extent, parody and satire religions, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster and such. So she was very kind and offered to contribute it forward. There's an introduction by myself kind of introducing the notion of poetic faith and trying to at least begin an intellectual history thereof. Again, peering into the nooks and crannies of history and saying, look there. And then, the body of the book is 5 interviews with people who have taken this unusual step from wildly different perspectives and different backgrounds, different angles. The premise is, though, that the interviewers have all followed the same basic structure of about 6 or 7 questions, with plenty of room for digressions on both sides. And the process was that all of the interviews were conducted by Zoom. They were then transcribed. The transcribed interviews were sent to the interviewees with the open invitation that they could do whatever they liked. They could amend them, they could rewrite them completely if they wished, because I was very, very keen that every interview should represent the interviewee exactly as they wished to be represented. And some of them took that on board and did very thorough kind of re-edits when they had time to think. Others just tweaked a few words. That was entirely up to them. And the last section of the book is something that I contributed, which is called the Cult Punk Manifesto. And that's a rather provocative, I think, statement of what this stuff might be and might turn into in the years to come.
Well, I will say
sort of an appendix.
Your both your introduction and your cult punk manifesto are excellent. I mean, it's worth the price of admission just for those alone. So I'm glad those exist in publication format. And it really is. You do a lovely, in a sense, as you kind of call it, an intellectual history of this idea, drawing from Coleridge, from Oscar Wilde, and a number of thinkers on into the 20th century, looking at the neo-pagan movement and versions of this that show up there, and really just cover a lot of ground of how this is manifested in various forms under various guises historically, and so that's both revealing and just a really fascinating kind of thing to read to give some context to this. But that cult punk manifesto is just a delight as well, and I think really succinctly captures the ideas and the ethos behind a lot of this, which I would describe as countercultural, artistic, fringe, a bit a tweak of sort of rebellious, but also I think very earnest in nature. And in fact, I guess I would kind of set me up to ask this question, which is, you'd mentioned like you think this is a very metamodern thing, and I wanted to ask you about that a little bit. Like, how do you see poetic faiths playing into notions of metamodernism or metamodern spirituality?
I would say this is going to sound incredibly conceited, and possibly even naive and all sorts of terrible things. But it may be that what we're talking about here is the next step. Once metamodern, perhaps it's the fruition of a lot of the theorizing that currently happens in metamodern spiritual circles. And I think it'll sound naive because I'm barely qualified to even comment on that. My comprehension of metamodernism is very basic. But where I see metamodern spirituality, metamodern meaning making now, I would suggest that the idea of poetic faith, the idea of taking the bull by the horns, deciding, giving yourself permission to become an artist in this area, that's possibly the next step beyond the theory.
There's a number of layers here. Well, one, actually, you probably, I must have sent this even to you at some point, but it's going back to the kind of earlier 2010 seminal paper, the Dutch theorist talking about metamodernism, and the ironic sincerity and all of that stuff. There was a webzine that they were publishing, and I published a piece in there called Metamodern. What did I call it? Reconstruction, Metamodernism, and the Return of Transcendence, or something like that, or the Return of Myth. But it had to do with this notion of, I think that, yeah, what you're saying is sort of like there's this next move that comes after, as you put it, once you take certain things kind of for granted. If you don't have to fight the battles of modernity, of modernity and rationality versus religion and belief, and like do all that, right? You kind of started from the premise that we're, in a sense, we've digested a lot of that stuff already. We've also digested a lot of the kind of postmodern ability to see, these sociological structures and how they work and how they kind of form people's ideologies and belief systems, and, kind of get a sense for that. And also kind of deconstruct a lot of the authoritarian power structures and the various ways that these things have historically worked to orient people and meld the minds of people in a particular direction. Kind of once you've done that, then you're, as you say, like, so what? So what's next? And I think that in that the sensibility described by the kind of cultural studies metamodern folks is really germane here, because speaking to the basically the as if orientation that we can adopt to you call it the suspension of disbelief, which I've also used to frame this, that there's a way of willfully in stepping into certain modalities that we kind of can kind of through our own self-awareness adopt willingly, but then also allow ourselves to kind of, once we're in the theater and the doors are closed and the lights are off, you can take in what's going on in the theater, and that can be a very powerful, meaningful, profound experience that has a deep uh, intensity and profundity, I think is the word that you use to it. We can take things for their profundity and as profound, even if we don't take them literally. So anyway, that's just my take on all of that. There's the various strands of that metamodern discourse that I think speak to different aspects of this. And one of it is the kind of sincerely ironic move in this direction, but it's also a kind of developmental move because it's building on all these laid down notions that we've gotten from the modern and the postmodern and all that. That's kind of my take on it. But I think that you're articulating this next move very well in this work. Okay, well, so I think that's a really good setup for what this book is. But then I'd be curious to hear more about you and how you kind of came to this. And I know also you have a interview yourself in this anthology where you talk about your poetic faith, the Mysterium. So could you speak a little bit to, I guess, what got you into this? How you kind of found yourself writing, or I should say, editing an anthology of this nature, and what your own poetic faith and the development of that has, what role that played in all of this?
Sure. With the proviso and with the sort of introductory comment that I'm in the midst of writing a memoir on the subject. Quite a chunk of the interview that appears in the anthology, which we've just been editing, includes this same information. And also, I've told the story over a number of interviews. So I kind of have I don't want to call it pat, but I have kind of ritualized over the years of doing this sort of thing, this as a sort of an origin story. I call it the story of the three moments. So, born and raised in New Zealand, of all places, that explains the accent. Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. Born a long time ago now, 1967, during the Summer of Love. Raised in an entirely atheistic family, second generation atheist on my dad's side, basically third on my mother's. And New Zealand is a very secular country, one of the least religious developed countries in the world. but I had a formative moment on a family vacation to San Francisco. I would have been about 10, and found myself standing outside of the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum there, which is a wonderful tourist trap sort of thing. And they had set up on the sidewalk a bed of nails. And I had a kind of an unusual upbringing, I guess, because my dad had been involved in sort of culture making and in the media for a long time. He had been an actor and a voice producer, voiceover artist, Punch and Judy puppet man when he was a teenager, a magician for a while. So I'd kind of grown up with this behind the scenes understanding of how culture works and how the media happens. Television shows weren't a great mystery to me because I'd been in rehearsal studios. By the age of 10, I'd written and performed in plays myself. All of which is to say that I knew the trick for lying down on a bed of nails. And I figured, because I was 10, I was naive, that the reason you have a bed of nails set up outside your Believe It or Not museum is so that people can lay down and have pictures taken. So that's what I did. The formative moment was that as I was lying down on this thing, as I was turning my head for Dad to take his photograph, however many seconds that took, a crowd materialized out of nowhere. By the time my head's turned, I'm facing a sea of adults, American adults, who are gaping at me. Oh my God, what's this kid doing? Oh my God. And I was intensely shy at that age. I really didn't want to be the center of attention of a group of gaping American adults. But Dad took his picture. I kind of got up and scurried away. But that experience really struck a chord with me because at the age of 10, I would have assumed that American adults would be the sophisticates who would understand how this sort of thing was done, basically by virtue of adulthood. The fact that they didn't kind of amazed me. Mm. And it struck this really, I became very interested in the phenomenon of belief, why people believe things. That developed into an interest in, as a young teenager, I started to go into the library. I'd look in books. This was the early 1980s, a lot of books on cults. So I became deeply interested in cults for a while. But then the interest in cults, it kind of became like watching Scooby-Doo cartoons. It's interesting insofar as the villain is wearing a different monster mask each week. But ultimately, it's always the same story. As an older teenager, I started going out and investigating. I'd visit some of the local New Age groups and outposts to some of the classic old British occult societies, the anthroposophists and theosophists and such. Never with an aim of finding a new belief system for myself, because I've always just been boringly satisfied with the kind of rational humanism, but because I was interested in the people. And as part of that exploration, came across the idea of, exactly as you said, creative spirituality, which was in connection with neo-paganism. I read Michael Adler's wonderful book, Drawing Down the Moon, which is a survey of the neo-pagan scene in America during the 70s, and came across sections in that book where she was talking about, or interviewing, senior pagans who said, no, this is not a supernatural thing to me. I believe that the gods are poetic archetypes. They're mythological constructs. I find that by behaving as if, in a ritual context, my life is better. And they do all of this without surrendering their sense of rationality, without, that this was something that improved their lives in what seemed to me to be a very meaningful way. I took that as permission to start doing it myself. And it may be worth mentioning for younger viewers and listeners that this was a long time before the internet, and New Zealand is a small country isolated at the bottom of the world. Very frequently, if you develop, or if I develop an interest in something, you'd go to the library, you'd find the one book that might exist. You may not find anything at all. So it was a sort of imagination-rich and information-poor upbringing and environment. But having sort of given myself permission via reading these few quotes in the Adler book, I started going out into the world in my early 20s, I guess, and doing some pretty extreme things. I gave myself permission to invent my own. I didn't think of it then as poetic faith, but effectively that was what I was doing. my practices and my sort of collection of inspirations from all sorts of sources, from movies and poems and mythologies and iconographies and so forth, fairly quickly began to coalesce around this idea of positive existentialism. Because I have never believed that I was destined to go on to a supernatural afterlife. I don't believe in literal reincarnation. But if you take that idea seriously, then it means that you only have this one life in this one world. And I did take that seriously, and I began to kind of ritualize and mythologize that concept. That, to cut a long story very much shorter, became the foundation of what I eventually started to call the Mysterium. So the whole, that's the background, but the whole process has been about 35 years of developing a canon of what I think of as touchstones, these sort of formative key motifs and concepts, threading them together through ritual practice, and then enacting them almost all of my life on a very personal, private, underground basis.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, can you speak a little bit to some of your practice, actually? And again, this is actually a really lovely setup for people who want kind of the full story. You can get the book, and you've got an interview in there where you go into. It's a very powerful story, and there were a couple other moments you didn't speak to, which I know through other conversations with you that are really striking and really bring this home in a powerful way. And we can either get to those later, or again, people can check out the anthology. But to give people a sense of your kind of daily practicing of your poetic faith, which you call the Mysterium. Speak to some of that a little bit, so to give people a sense.
Sure. It's so simple, really. The Mysterium is just a poetic handle. A handle is useful if you're going to be picking something up, I guess. Sometimes I just think of it as a way of life and death. Occasionally I've called it blendism. And it's a thing to do much more than a thing to think about at this point in my life. It's so simple that it can be reduced to a single motto, which is the phrase memento mori ergo carpe diem, remember death and therefore seize the day. And it's so simple it can be reduced to a single totem, which is the floral, and I'm wearing it right now, the crown wearing the skull wearing the floral crown. And from those bases, it kind of spreads out into the canon of touchstones that I was talking about earlier. A whole constellation of stories, parables, teaching stories, practices, pilgrimages, practices of charity, rituals of memorial, rituals of initiation, of journaling, writing, meditations, and so on. But the whole thing is drawn together through this simple system of iconography and ritual practice.
Well, and speak to I know you. There's how would you say? There's a really powerful way that this structures time for you as well, in terms of the kind of the growing time and the fading time, and then also your daily you have a daily ritual that you engage in to reflect on this, if you'd be willing to talk to any of that.
Yeah. Conceptually, I define the ritual year of the Mysterium into two halves. We have Floralia, which is the springtime, the time of generation, and when the flowers are starting to grow. And there's a series of ritual practices that one performs during that time of year. And then offered up probably really more importance, I guess, probably just because I'm hovering around 60 now, is the second half of the year, which is Memoria, which we're deep into at the moment. And that's the death time. That's the time when the local river starts running red and gold with fallen leaves. That's the beginning of Memoria. And again, there's a series of ritual practices throughout that season. The daily stuff, there are really a lot of small things that I do and that I practice. I indicated before my little set of talismans here. Every morning, each of them have symbolic values. I don't think we have time to go into those here, but each morning when I put this thing on, I repeat the phrase "Memento mori ergo carpe diem." Um, Behind me, over in this direction, there is a shrine that I've created, inspired by the aesthetic of Vanitas painting. Some of your viewers may be familiar with that. And that's simply always there. There are certain ritual activities that I perform with the shrine. It also holds certain items that I use, for example, in occasional memorial rituals when I have occasion to do that. And the daily practice involves really the only kind of meditation that I have is a ritual pilgrimage, which is inspired originally by the Japanese tradition of Shugendo, but which you can find parallels in many, many different religious traditions, the idea of the walkabout or the vision quest. The daily thing is that I have a circuit that takes me about 45 minutes walking along the banks. We happen to live right next to one of the prettiest and bendiest sections of the Chicago River. And my daily walk, which I'll do twice a day during the warmer months, takes me along that path. And there are 7 different ritual stations that I've just conjured over the years that we've been living here. And so at each point, most of them are very quiet, hardly noticeable if someone passes by. But they are symbolic actions that I undertake every day. I'll describe one of them here. There's a section of the riverbank that is all little white stones, thousands and thousands of little white pebbles. So every day I will walk down to that section, find one, kind of test it for heft. Does this one feel right for this day? I'll put it in my satchel and carry on. I'll do a few other things. Eventually I get to a footbridge over the Chicago River. I'll remove the stone from the satchel, and at this point, this stone represents my life. Repeat a certain poetic phrase, and I toss the stone out into the middle of the river. Watch the light and then watch the splash. And depending on what the river happens to be doing in a given day, sometimes the river is flowing very fast and rough. And under those circumstances, there's barely a splash. And sometimes the river is as slow as almost still. And under those circumstances, the splash is this sort of big impressive thing. And you can see the concentric circles of ripples just flowing out. Those are very instructive, I think, because of course, in my schema, the stone is my life. The flight of the stone is the course of my life. And then the inevitable splash and the sink down into the mud, that's my inevitable death. It's easy to describe that. And when people read the book, they'll read this and they'll be able to visualize it for a moment. But it's the physical enactment, it's the embodiment of this practice. I place a very, very great stock into the sensory, the kinesthetic, the kinetic, the emotional. I think I have a very sort of kinetic and emotional concept of spirituality. It's all about the embodiment. So really, there's very little in the way of theory in the Mysterium. Material science covers all of the whys and wherefores. I'm very much concerned with the project of re-enchantment and of using the iconographies and the aesthetics and the rituals of the Mysterium to experience and to conjure and to create some of that re-enchantment for me on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And then there are also bigger and grander things that happen on particular occasions. But I think that gives you a sense of it.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a really helpful. I mean, so returning to the notion of sort of taking, as it were, secular humanism as the starting place, I think people might hear that and say, well, wait, I don't understand. I thought he was taking secular humanism for granted and there's no rituals or anything like that. Like this doesn't, there's going to be jarring in people's minds about this. And I think that that's an interesting thing that's a generative tension for people, I think, to explore. Like why people might think, oh, well, don't people only do rituals because they're, under the kind of mind control of some naive, superstitious religion. And as soon as they realize that that's not true, that they don't have to do any of that. So I don't know, say a little bit more about what this means to you, what role you think this fulfills, what function it plays, given that this isn't operating in that way.
Sure. Yeah. The cliche is mindless rituals.
Hmm.
So I would encourage those people initially to think about what a mindful ritual might
Hmm.
involve.
Hmm.
The Statue of Liberty is a useful example here. I don't think that anyone living today closely associates the Statue of Liberty in New York City with Libertas, with the Roman personification of freedom, which was her original genesis, if you go back far enough. It is broadly understood that the Statue of Liberty is a poetic construct. It's a personification. But here's the thing. It's a personification of an ideal that people do, in fact, take really, really seriously.
Hmm.
It's the ideal of freedom. And people go to New York City. I've been to New York City a number of times, and I always feel good when I see that statue towering up over the harbor. And I always, will think to myself, the line, you give us your Hubble masses, you need to breathe free. That's beautiful, moving stuff.
Hmm.
World needs that concept, that pure concept of freedom, now possibly more than it has for a long time. So the ritual, let's say that going to New York, you take a boat out to Staten Island or whatever, and Liberty Island, I think, and you visit the statue. Now, yes, it's a tourist attraction and it's a sort of a thing that you do, but if you do it mindfully, then you're making effectively a ritual pilgrimage to this symbol, because it has this kind of archetypal, really deeply emotional, sentimental meaning that you take really seriously. And I apply that logic to all of my work in poetic faith. There is no point in doing the thing unless it is deeply personally meaningful to you. And I think that's what makes it mindful. The answer to the question, though, it's also that, so secular humanism, I think for a long time, really since the foundations of humanism as a philosophical movement, there has been a broad and sometimes spoken assumption that once secular humanism is widely applied and understood, then the people will be freed from the bounds of authoritarian superstition. And then they will go forth into the world and they will experience the wonders of democratized art and scientific and science and so forth. And I think that that's true, but perhaps for a smaller number of people than the founders of humanism might have hoped. I think that for a lot of people, it's really useful to have a more structured and a more specific point of focus. So for me, that's the Mysterium. But for many people, it wouldn't be. So insofar as I offer the Mysterium to the world, it's as one aspect of this constellation of ritualized philosophies and poetic faith practices, which is really the point of the anthology. So
Yeah.
I would imagine a small number of people might get very into the idea of the Mysterium, and they might want to focus on that. But for others, it can be this thing that they do in addition to participating in M. Dudek's religion virus, in addition to taking part in some Aratean rituals or some of Deborah Kelly's creation mystique, that mythology. The same person might go along to one of these extraordinary sort of ritualized religious psychedelic rave, which is a large part of the practice of the First Church of David Bowie, Phonomancer. The same person, I'm sure, would get a great deal out of visiting Stephen Jenkinson's Orphan Wisdom School. So I've just cited the 5 people who are interviewed in the first anthology. So what I am aiming towards, what I'm hoping towards, what I'm frankly willing to dedicate the rest of my life to, is this notion of the kind of mycelial underground counterculture of poetic faiths popping up all over the damn place. Jamie Wheel talks about ethical cults. Sometimes I talk about rational cults. This network of poetic faiths that pop up, and some of them inevitably will die out, and others will propagate and flourish. They will all be fun. They'll all be meaningful. They'll all be interesting. and they'll blend together over time. And I think that perhaps is a vision for this thing that comes after humanism and maybe the next step for metamodern spirituality. I'm not sure that I articulated it.
No, well, that last
kind of
bit there is really interesting to me, and it was one of the first aspects of this that really seemed, I don't know how to describe it. There's a kind of invitation to some grand cultural reconstructive project, which was interesting, and highly compelling. At the same time, I'm interested what you would make of this kind of practice because it seems, as you know, it's very personal, right? It's creative. It's like it's a work of art. It's like someone's thing that they've made to be able to speak to what they find meaningful, as you say, and engage that in a profound manner. So there's a highly idiosyncratic element to it. You know, each of these poetic faiths and the folks that you talk to in this anthology are all doing something rather different. I mean, there's a broad category that unites them, but in terms of what the specifics are, they're quite different. So, my question would be, what do you see as the future of this? And I share your vision there too. I'd love to see this mycelial rhizomatic, outgrowth of this happening all over the place, and then cross pollination and cross fertilization and all these things. But I guess the question I'm curious about is like, do you think that primarily this is a way for individuals to construct a meaningful system for their own lives, or is this an invitation to create something that then could grow and spread, in a sense, be a new kind of collective meaning system, right? Like that, there's always been this tension there for me because I think that our current what John Vervaeke calls our legacy religions have kind of reached a certain limit, arguably, in what they're able to afford our current moment based on the kinds of meaning-making structures that they're inheriting from the past. And so there's this invitation then to start reconstructing meaning systems and religious systems for the future based on a lot of the knowledge that we've developed over the past 500 years. And yet we don't necessarily want to just see another great, totalizing Catholic Church. We also want this kind of beautiful diversity and this kind of differentiation. So yeah, the question in there, which, I'll repeat again, is something like, is this, are poetic faiths for individual people to construct, or is this something where there's a kind of variation and retention process underway where we're trying to find that new thing for everyone, if that makes sense?
At the moment, it's for individuals, individuals in small groups. My hope is that over time, there will be enough individuals and small groups as to establish a scene. And I use that term quite specifically in the sense of a punk rock scene or a goth scene. And from there, we could talk about subcultures and countercultures and stuff. And the idea of atomized culture. You familiar with that?
Not really. I mean, I could imagine, but
yeah. So the suggestion is that counterculture happened during this, let's say, the 60s and 70s in response to Nixon, the Vietnam War, and the very aggressive attempt at monoculture, a sort of a top-down imposition of monoculture that took place especially in America during the 1950s. 60s and 70s were a rebellion against that. The counterculture of the 60s and 70s, I would suggest, was actually remarkably successful in a number of ways, successful in influencing the mainstream of culture in a variety of ways through the civil rights movements and so forth, environmental movements. That all kind of worked. And we've been living in the sort of the afterglow of that for a long time. But meanwhile, another counterculture has been on the rise, and so now we're at the beginning of that new phase where that's beginning to influence the dominant culture. Unfortunately for me at this point in my life. So what I foresee is that the more individuals, the more people who feel empowered as individuals to first name themselves as artists in this very niche sphere of the artistic invention of soulfulness. The more people who are able to do that, the wider and more colorful and diverse and interesting this nascent scene becomes. And the more it's spread through various spheres of communication, like metamodernism, and I know Game B is one, and integral, and spiritual naturalism and religious naturalism. There are lots of these now, but just popping up largely over the past 10 years, which is why this is kind of exciting for me. I think that through all of that propagation, in another maybe 10 years, there will be enough works of media, festivals, art exhibits, academic studies, and so forth, to have established, to have sort of seeded this idea that it actually has some cultural legs. And then maybe in 25 years, the people who I teach or inspire or whatever at this point, or during the rest of my life, they will become the, in a sense, sort of the chaplains of this upcoming counterculture, and we don't know what that's going to be called. It's all very exciting at the moment.
Yeah,
but I think that's kind of the state of it at the moment. It's the work of individuals by default. I am very keen on doing whatever I can to propagate a scene, with the idea that that scene will then develop into something like an identifiable countercultural force.
yeah, yeah. And likewise, I mean, that's a similar shared mission and vision, and it is incredibly exciting, one, to consider the possibilities of what this could become, but two, to see the nascent forms of this when you look out at culture today and you name some of the groups where I've been really heartened to find like-minded individuals who get it, where I was so delighted when I found some of these folks in kind of my tribe, where I could say, hey, I'm doing this mythopoetic thing, and I didn't have to explain, no, I'm not inventing a cult, at least not in the kind of pejorative way, right? But maybe, those for whom ideas of ethical cults and rational cults and the kinds of dynamics and sensibilities you're describing are kind of, again, like the given, and it just saves a lot of time. You don't have to do all of that. It's like, okay, now what? And how can we work with this? And it opens up these really fascinating questions around, um, basically what this does eventually, mm, what this does eventually become and grow into, and how that organizes itself, and how these things relate to each other. And, how do we, for example, kind of have our own either implicit or explicit kind of uh, formal approaches to how we recognize when something is kind of, going down a dark route in these sorts of things, and say, no, 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 that's not what we're talking about. Or how do we say, oh, this is a really successful version of this thing that we're talking about? Or, and what kinds of modes of connection and kind of like media exchanges might become possible in the future. I have multiple times tried to set up some kind of like a commons or a wiki structure where people could, like, upload their own materials, and then they could all be part of this database, and people could share and interact, and almost make this sort of like a intersecting fan fiction style Poetic Faiths database and treasury and canon, where these things could come together and mutate and all this stuff. It's a fascinating prospect, that also then connects to these really, really important social visions and philosophical projects, like John Vervaeke's, what he's now calling the philosophical Silk Road, and earlier was calling the religion that's not a religion. You mentioned Jamie Wheel and Meaning 3.0, I think he calls it. And I've talked a lot about this in my own books, and so there's all that. And then, of course, there's a number of folks that you've brought to my attention through the work that you've been doing in this anthology, that it's like, oh yes, more people doing this. This is really exciting. So I do think we're very much kind of at the beginning of something. I've always been struck by how potentially fraught this can be. But I actually have seen mostly good actors in the space. I've never really encountered anyone trying to come into this space with their own poetic faith and then, actually like become a guru that, starts abusing people or anything. I think again, the premises that kind of undergird the whole thing are kind of self-selective for that. And so it guards against the kind of maliciousness or kind of self-servingness that often shows up in more naive, less rational forms of this. But yeah, thinking about the ethics of this, it just creates a whole set of really fascinating ideas and things to explore. And I think the work that you're doing is excellent, and it's really at the forefront of it. And I really appreciated this work. I'm looking forward to the future works in this series that you're putting out, and getting to know more of the people who are doing this through your interviews. And so, yeah, so thank you for that. Well, let's start to bring this to a close. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this book or Poetic Faiths or the work that you're doing or anything?
You referred to Vervaeke's philosophical Silk Road.
Mm.
Yeah. What I would like is for, let's say, for the Mysterium, which is just my own practice, to be what I've sometimes semi-jokingly referred to as a philosophical Silk Road side attraction. And I think that there's the potential for all of the poetic faiths that we deal with in the first volume of the book and then in subsequent volumes as well, to serve the same sort of function. I think those are steps towards creating this scene. None of, or actually no, some of them do. Some of them have the ambition of being everything to everyone.
Mm.
I would say most of them don't. My one certainly doesn't. I have a very humble ambition of what I do being of direct inspiration and service to a very small number of people, and of being perhaps indirect inspiration to a rather larger number of folks. And then that at that point, it kind of bleeds out into the general notion of poetic faith, of establishing this as an idea, as a practice, as a discipline, as something that academics will study, as something that documentaries will be produced about, and so forth. So,
well, I have a question
that's
on
the
that
vision.
front.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so if someone were to read this book and read you talking about the Mysterium and your practices and all that and the basic idea behind it, and they say, wow, like this really speaks to me. And they get in touch with you and they say, Tony Wolf, like I want to be a member of the Mysterium. Like, what do I do? Is there, an initiation process or this sort of thing? Like, how do you feel about being in that situation? Is that something that you welcome? Is it something you're trepidatious about? Do you feel like people have misunderstood something if they're looking to be a member of the Mysterium or something like, because I think that sort of thing is maybe to some degree inevitable and maybe even a very good thing. Maybe that is like a sign of what service you're offering to people actually connecting and resonating. But yeah.
That hasn't happened really. I mean, this stuff is so new. Like I was saying before, I didn't tell the part of the story about it the moment that I decided to make the Mysterium public.
Mm.
That's one of the three moments. But that was very recent. That was as a direct result, really, of the COVID pandemic. So that's only what 4 years ago, 5 years. Up until then, it had always been my own, basically secret underground weird thing that I did. So I never had the ambition of teaching it or anything like that. And over the past 5 years, I've been sort of tentatively moving towards that in various forums. But it really hasn't happened. I'm in the process of writing a sort of it's half memoir, half, as it were, instructional manual on this stuff. And that will be kind of the first time that people who read that, they'll have a solid a concept of what this thing is and how to do it as anybody. But that hasn't been released yet. We did an experimental initiation ritual, I guess, a couple of years ago now in Brooklyn and New York, which was very avant-garde and was sort of open to artists. And then more recently, we did the mystery school event at Sky Meadow, where I taught, as it were, a number of the practices and rituals and such, in addition to doing all the nice, wholesome farm work and so on. I think it's too early for me to even answer that question. If someone came to me under those circumstances right now, in a spirit of generosity, I would be very open to giving them all the various materials that I have. But it's barely at a stage. I mean, I'm not set up to be a master or to have disciples and such. And I'm not really sure that's a good idea.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, but that's like this deeper question, right? Like I'm thinking of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra towards the end, right? He's like, Zarathustra doesn't want followers. Zarathustra wants, competitors in a sense, right? He wants
Yeah,
if you just want to be a disciple of Zarathustra's, then in a sense you've missed that his what his teaching is, which is something about going out and finding your own thing. So I'm curious, though, because this is a tension I experienced in my own version of doing these kinds of projects. Is the point of it to offer, in a sense, content out into the world to help people in their own meaning making process and ritualization engagement? Or is it to teach people a process for their own content creation that allows them to do that in a very, a personalized way? I feel like maybe the answer is both, but it is interesting which aspect of that one leans into because, yeah, if someone finds a person's poetic faith, and then they say, "Oh yes, this is it. This is something I want to be a part of." I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but at the same time, there's this whole other aspect to this whole project, this kind of endeavor that's like, well, if you really want to do it, then in a sense, kind of make your own. But maybe there's also ways of where this material can land for people and the different uses they can put it to and the different sense they can make from it. But yeah.
I think the answer is both. I think that your latter point is absolutely potentially the sort of the platonic ideal of the situation, where there's enough of a scene, there's enough diversity and variety and establishment and innovation and all of these things that people can find a place and kind of develop from there. I would be delighted if someone, and the difficult thing for me is I'm sort of trying to answer from two levels. We've been talking about the Mysterium, which is my own
Hmm.
personal, barely released into the world practice. But also as the editor of the anthology, I have a much more
Yeah.
holistic
Yeah.
view of the whole thing. So I'm feeling that tension. Um, I would accept, I'll modify what I said before. I would accept disciples on a kind of role-playing basis.
Hmm.
So, like the event that we did at Sky Meadow, the mystery school, when it's appropriate, I would step into kind of the guru master persona. When I'm leading a ritual, that just makes sense because you're the one who knows what's supposed to happen.
Hmm.
Um, and so under those circumstances, I guess I'm playing the role of the wise elder, which is reasonable because I have in fact been doing this stuff. I invented it and I've been practicing it for 35 years. So that's
Hmm.
it's not really a difficult leap for me to make. And I would suggest that the other people there are willingly suspending their disbelief in a sense and stepping into the roles of the disciples and the students.
Hmm.
And I think that they gain from that. But then once the ritual is over,
Hmm.
then I take off my imaginary master hat and I help out washing the dishes and
Hmm.
making the dinner and having fun chats with people and
Hmm.
watching TV. I think that element also serves to guard against the guru,
Yeah.
the risks of the grotesque excesses of gurudom.
Yeah.
I've talked sometimes about the idea of the expert pundit guru pipeline. I mentioned this in another interview some time ago. Um, I think at the age of hovering around 60, yes, I'm legitimately, I could be considered to be an expert in certain very niche areas. The Mysterium is one of them. The wider concept of poetic faiths is another. Ritual design, probably, yeah. To some extent, various works of art and such. Um, so I'm comfortable being the wise old elder in those specific regards. But unless you're careful, that notion of expertise of being that kind of elder just bleeds out into becoming a pundit where people are coming to you for answers for
Yeah.
all sorts of questions. And it takes, I don't know, a small enough ego or a strong enough ego or some combination of those to be able to say, dude, I don't know. Ask someone else. I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But then if you don't do that, then I think the danger is that you move from pundit to guru. And suddenly you're not only supposed to have the answer for everything, but you're supposed to be in control of everything.
Mm.
And I don't want to be in control of everything. I'd be terrible at that.
Yeah. Well, I've always said, you do come to a lot of this with a great sense of humility. And it's that classic trope of, it's always those people who don't want anything to do with positions of power that really deserve them most and would probably be best at them. So I think that speaks well to anyone who, is sort of kind of almost falling into these kinds of roles rather than like actively seeking them out. Oh, I want to be the wizard sage, you know. It's like I think that there's an ironic paradox there, that the people who tend to stick more towards the back and be the wallflower, and then it's like, hey, like this guy's actually the got some wisdom here. And I see that with you. But I want to draw back that more of an analogy to art, because I feel like that really is in many ways kind of a really helpful genre to situate this in. I mean, the subtitle of the book is New Religions and Rituals as Works of Living Art. And for me, art as like, or like religion as art. I mean, I did my master's at Yale Divinity School in religion and the arts for this reason. I was really fascinated by the way in which aesthetics and art and creativity like that can be deep, you know, can be where that bleeds into the religious in many, many ways, right? Even notions of inspiration, I think, are really telling in that sense of you go back to Homer and it was this conceived of, you know, calling upon a goddess and, you know, being infused with inspiration in that sense. And the inspiration, you know, the having the spirit come inside you. But we speak of artistic inspiration as well, right? And we speak of that kind of that coming out. So anyway, there's so many things there that would be its own fascinating conversation. But it just specifically came up for me as being really helpful when we were talking a second ago about like what would be the ideal form, is maybe people doing this novel thing that they do and take in new directions, but also it's good to just sort of, you know, find a particular poetic faith as well and work with that if you want. And I think that that's almost like a genre, right? Like when you think about I don't know, like blues music, right? It's the same progression, right? You give it a little tweak here and there, you make it slightly your own, and now you've got, you know, all these different blues songs, but it's clearly recognizable as that genre. And it's great to make music in a particular genre, and you can just say, I'm a blues player, and like, okay, great. We know what that's like, and that's really valuable. And then you do also get people who are really like genre creating artists, you know, people like I don't know, Chris Steele comes to mind. He's a mandolin player, or Bela Fleck, some of those, they're some favorites of mine, but people who wind up fusing genres together or taking instruments and moving them into places they've never been before and kind of pioneering new things, that then creates a new space where, in a sense, you've got a new genre now and people can follow you into that space. And both of those modes are musicianship, right? There's nothing bad about an excellent blues player, and there's nothing bad about a genre creating artist, and there's nothing particularly better about one than the other. They're both really valuable, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And so I think similarly in this sense, like creating a poetic faith could be of great value, but also engaging with these poetic faiths that people are putting out in kind of operating in that genre that's been created is also really valuable. So that was just a metaphor that came to mind for this.
Yeah, I think that's very apt. We can also compare it, as I do in the introduction, to the origins of the neo-pagan scene, where talking about the counterculture earlier. I mean, that movement has its more ultimate origins back in the 40s and 50s as this tiny little countercultural group in England. But it exploded in the 60s and 70s, particularly on the west coast of the US. And it was a generation of people. The first time that this poetic faith notion has been adopted on generation-wide scale, who felt suddenly empowered by the fact that the 60s and the 70s were happening to get creative with the very notion of what religion and spirituality and soulfulness could be. And a lot of those original efforts at neo-pagan practice, they began as jokes, or they began as theatrical experiments. And then people found through the doing, through the enactment, through the embodiment, that they were in fact getting a lot out of it, often to their own surprise. And so they continued on that basis, and deepened it and broadened it and heightened it and so forth. I can foresee, again, we're talking right now about establishing something that may eventually develop into that sort of a countercultural scene, where people may feel empowered by the examples of, and from this point of view, we are sort of the forerunners, who may be inspired by our direct examples, but may also be inspired by, for example, once they've read let's say that there are 3 volumes in the Poetic Faiths Anthology. By the time people have read all of them, they will have read at least 15 different takes on this same question, the same subject, from radically different perspectives often. and with different themes and different aesthetics and wildly different practices. And I hope that what will come out of that is a sense, first of all, of permission, that you can, in fact, declare yourself as an artist who is capable of doing this. And it took me a long time to think of myself as an artist, decades. That's a recent thing. They'll feel that sense of permission. They will have a perspective informed by this constellation of examples. And they will feel it as a matter of priority because of the circumstances of their own lives. This is something that I want to devote myself to. And the more artists we have, the more self-declared artists we have working in this nascent sphere, the stronger, the more diverse, the more interesting, the more fun the sphere becomes.
Yeah.
The stronger the whole thing gets. And then we arrive in 25 or 30 years, or maybe 15 years. Things move faster these days, atomized culture and stuff. Maybe during my lifetime, that would be nice. Then we arrive at this sort of scintillating metamodern meaning space that I think we're probably all moving towards. And like I said, I think that's something that I am willing to devote the rest of my life to at least hoping to achieve.
Well, thank you, and likewise. And great to talk to you about this. A great book again. I'll be sharing this around a lot, and I'm really excited and honored to have this one as not this one, these 3 or more volumes as part of the Sky Meadow Press series. And yeah, I guess just want to say thank you for the book. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the various opportunities we've had to collaborate. You mentioned the Mystery School, and I look forward to other opportunities like that. And it gives me the idea as well to potentially do some kind of series. Maybe we can, I don't know, like interview the various contributors to the volumes or something in like a podcast format, so people can also engage with them that way. Because yeah, there's a lot of value to be gained by people being able to interface with these things and try to bring some network cohesion to them as well, which is a really fascinating topic. But
yes, please.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Tony Wolff. Check out the incredible book, Poetic Faiths, Volume 1, and we'll be talking again before long, I suspect. So take care, my friend.
Thanks, man.